have you ever stopped to wonder, how we actually define who truly belongs to a nation? It's a massive question, right? It's driving huge political debates today. But to find a genuinely radical answer, a recent analysis suggests we might actually need to look back a few centuries. Today we're diving into a provocative new report called The Color of Citizenship. It basically challenges everything we assume about modern immigration law by holding it up against an ancient moral compass. So, whether you follow immigration policy closely or you're just kind of curious about the philosophical nuts and bolts of citizenship, stick around. This is a fascinating deep dive that really challenges the bedrock of statehood and belonging.
Now, the core of this whole analysis pivots on a pretty unexpected question. What on earth can a 7th century monarch teach modern democracies about citizenship? I know, it sounds like an impossible comparison, right? Matching an ancient king against a massive, complex modern bureaucracy. But actually, this single question frames a really fascinating narrative. As you'll see, the authors are using a historical standard of sanctuary to critique the modern mechanisms of state protection.
So, where is this coming from? Well, this historical framing is the absolute centerpiece of a July 2026 report published by the Bayyina Foundation. Their explicit goal here is to unpack and really analyze the mechanics of UK immigration law. But, and here's the catch, rather than just dissecting dry legal statutes in a vacuum, the authors evaluate modern British law through the lens of a very specific ancient precedent. They want to see exactly how today's policies measure up to a much, much older standard of justice. To truly grasp their argument, we basically have to travel back in time. We're going to the year 615 CE. The entire foundation of this critique relies on a concept called aman, which translates to safe refuge and absolute sanctuary. Picture this. At that time, a small band of Muslims were facing horrific torture and persecution in Mecca. Completely desperate for survival, they fled across the Red Sea, seeking out the Christian kingdom of Abyssinia. And they went there specifically in search of Aman, hoping to find a place where they could live in absolute safety under a sovereign's protection.
And that sovereign was the Negus of Abyssinia, Ashama ibn Abjar. The source text describes how envoys from Mecca actually tracked down these refugees. They arrived at the Negus's court demanding their immediate extradition. And they didn't come empty-handed either. They brought lavish gifts and bribes to secure the refugees' return. But here's the kicker. The Negus did not yield to the diplomatic pressure. He didn't judge these terrified refugees by their tribal origins. Instead, he summoned them, gave them a fair hearing, and delivered this really powerful declaration. "Go, for you are under my protection. Whoever harms you, harms me." For the report's authors, this moment represents an unbreakable covenant. It's the ultimate benchmark of a ruler granting sanctuary.
So, the Bayyina Foundation takes this ancient moral clarity and uses it to launch a pretty severe critique of the present day. They set up a stark contrast. On one side, you have the Negus Standard, which judges individuals strictly by their conduct, protects strangers from foreign persecution, and offers absolute sanctuary. On the other side is their view of modern British policy. And the authors argue that modern Britain represents the complete inversion of this historical standard. From their perspective, the current system judges individuals by their complexion, effectively persecutes its own citizens by treating them as permanent strangers, and, worst of all in their view, reduces the foundational birthright of citizenship to merely provisional permits.
Now, this isn't just philosophical. It's directly tied to the law, specifically the Nationality Act 1981. The Foundation argues that this modern legal framework grants the Home Secretary sweeping unilateral powers. According to their analysis, these executive powers allow the state to literally strip British citizens of their passports and deport them. And they stress a really crucial point here. This often happens not because someone was convicted of a severe crime in a British court, but simply because their ancestral origin triggers a bureaucratic assumption. It's a massive claim.
So, what does this threat actually look like in practice? Well, the authors point to individuals facing deportation to totally unfamiliar lands, based entirely on where their ancestors lived. Imagine being told you belong to a country you've never even lived in, whose language you might not even speak, and where you have literally zero tangible connection. To illustrate this, the report highlights the Windrush generation, Caribbean citizens who arrived as British subjects, built lives, and yet were denied documentation and deported to islands their grandparents had left decades ago. They also bring up a specific case of a Bangladeshi British teenager born in Tower Hamlets. He faced removal to Dhaka simply because the Home Office determined he theoretically could apply for a passport there, despite having never set foot in the country. Which brings the report to the central concept of the broken covenant. Look, if citizenship is supposed to be a reciprocal bond, loyalty to the state in exchange for inviolable security, the authors assert that modern policy completely shatters this trust. They contrast the historical Negus, who understood sovereignty as the quality of protection he offered, with modern Britain,
which the report claims treats sovereignty as the quantity of people it can remove. The analysis suggests that because security has become conditional upon ethnic origin, the state is effectively treating black and brown Muslims as provisional citizens. Ultimately, the report concludes that this whole system functions as administrative racism, just carefully dressed up in legal jargon.
Okay, so how do they say we fix it? To realign with that 7th century Negus Standard, the Foundation proposes 4 systematic legal reforms. The goal here is to eliminate discretionary exile entirely. First, they argue for abolishing the deprivation of citizenship and deportation for all lawful residents. The logic makes sense. If you commit a crime, you face a British prison, not banishment. Second, they propose only one exception: court-proven fraud in an original entry application. But even that comes with a strict 2-year sunset clause, meaning if someone has lived there for 2 years, paid taxes, formed a family, the state's error doesn't justify tearing that life apart. Third, they demand revoking the Home Secretary's exile powers entirely, handing those decisions over to independent tribunals that are legally barred from considering race or ancestry. And finally, step 4, retroactive restoration and compensation for anyone stripped of citizenship under these discretionary clauses since 2006.
The core logic behind these steps isn't just about slightly reducing bias in immigration policy. No, the authors want to surgically remove the legal instruments through which they argue that bias operates. Their philosophy is incredibly blunt. If the state legally cannot exile any citizen whatsoever, then it fundamentally cannot racially profile which citizen to exile. By instituting a strict prohibition on deportation for lawful residents, they argue you remove all bureaucratic discretion. Why? Because, as they point out, discretion is exactly where systemic prejudice hides.
Bringing this historical argument full circle, the authors use 2 distinct concepts to really define the soul of a nation. The ideal is Dar al-Aman, a true land of security and absolute sanctuary. But the report warns that when a nation reserves its harshest exclusions for specific demographics, when it breaks its foundational oath of protection, it risks becoming Dar al-Ghadara, a land of treacherous betrayers. That's a heavy label. The authors posit that if covenants of protection and trust are just ink on paper, easily blown away by political winds, well then the whole idea of Britain being a land of security becomes fundamentally hollow.
And that leads us to the end of our explainer today, where the report ultimately leaves us with one incredibly provocative question. Where is Britain's Negus? Think about it. The historical monarch asked only one thing of those seeking refuge: are you under my roof? He didn't ask about backup tribes, ancestral hamlets, or skin tones. He simply offered protection. The authors claim modern frameworks ask about absolutely everything else, creating what they describe as a rigged lottery. It really leaves us all to reflect. What truly defines a land of security today? And are modern democracies actually living up to a standard set centuries ago? It's definitely something to think about.